Hi, everyone. This is Bob Sorrentino from Italian Roots and Genealogy. Be sure to check out our blog, our YouTube channel, and our newsletter on our great sponsors, Your Dolce Vita, Italy Rooting, Phil Italy, and Abitativa Casa. And today I have a special guest all the way from Australia, Sal Provino. So welcome, Sal. Thanks for being here.
Nice to be here, Bob. I like when you speak Italian. I love it.
Yeah, that's about the extent of my Italian.
It sounds good. Keep it up.
But that buongiorno and ciao,
Bravo, bravo,
but
bravissimo.
for you, it's buonasera today, right?
It's actually buonasera here in Australia. It's just after 9 p.m.
So I'm keeping you up late.
No, no. Hey, we're Italian. We go to bed late. What are you talking about? What's the matter, you, eh?
So it's, I love having, I've had a few guests from Australia, and I love having people from Australia on because, here in America, especially us Italian Americans, we're very Italian American centric. So it's great to hear the stories from down under.
Well, I love your accent, number one. You guys have an accent.
Well, it paid off when we lived in England for 2 years, and it paid off because if somebody kind of went a little wonky on me, I would just say something in my New York accent, and that would take care of things right away.
Fantastic. Well, did you want me to tell you about my family?
So I want to ask you, why and when did you start doing research on your family?
I did research on my family. Started when I was about 20, so that's a long time ago now. It's well over half a century. And I was going to a church that really believed in genealogy and keeping family history intact and that sort of thing and keeping records. But I had an interest as a little boy because although I was born in Australia, my parents thought they could relocate to Italy back in the 60s, 1963. I was 7 years old. So we went back to Italy and just meeting all my cousins and my nonna and other relatives. I just wanted to know where we're from. And there's a lovely story about my paternal and my maternal side of the family. So I thought that for my children and grandchildren, I'd like to start a type of history record.
I didn't start that long ago. That's great that you started that long ago.
Yeah.
So back then it must have been, there was no internet or anything. You had to just use paper records and things, right?
But it was very frustrating because I did start writing to Il Comune in different places. And unfortunately, as you know, Italy is a very bureaucratic sort of society, but people don't like to look up books and things like that and, blow the dust off the book and look at who's who and that sort of thing. So it's better done when you're there in person, I found out. So that's what I did. I've been to Italy backwards and forwards dozens of times, and that's how I got a lot of information.
Yeah, and that's quite a trip from Australia to Italy, I guess, huh?
Well, yeah, it's only about 20 hours. Yeah, in a plane. we have our maps here of the world in Australia depict Australia being in the middle, but in actual fact, it's at the arse end of the world, where the last thing you go to.
Well, I guess every country does that, right? I suppose we do the same thing, yeah.
Yeah.
So your roots, if I remember correctly, your roots are in Calabria, right?
So basically, Dad came out from Sicily in 1952, and he came to Sydney, Australia, by ship, of course. They didn't have many flights back then. And Dad was in the police force, but he didn't like it. He just wanted to get away from the misery, the poverty, the famine, from the ravages of World War II. And they were promoting people. They were promoting for people to come from all countries over here, from England, from Greece, from Spain, from everywhere. So Dad hopped on a ship and came out, and he met my mum here after he was in Australia 2 years. He went to the fruit shop to buy his greens, his vegetale. And then the guy there says, "Oh, my sister's out from Italy." "Oh, really?" "Yes. Why don't you come over for dinner Friday night and meet her?" And the rest is history. My mum was out from Calabria, and Dad was learning English by reading the newspaper and talking and stuff like that. And he was in. Dad did a lot of construction work. Most immigrants here were bricklayers, carpenters, that sort of thing. And so they got married in 1955, and in 1956 I popped out, and Dad called me Salvino because he's Salvatore. My nonno, his father was Salvatore. My great grandfather was Salvatore, and I'm Salvino. So that's why I'm Sal.
Little Sal. Yeah, but that's my father.
Little Sal.
My father, well, in America, he was Nicholas, of course. That's what he was. That's his, given name. But his grandfather was Nicola. But I heard my cousins always refer to him as Little Nicky, that my grandmother used to call him in English. But then when I saw something that she wrote about him, he was Nicolino. So.
Okay. So I have to tell you, for the benefit of your listeners on your podcast, we call Tesla Nikola Tesla. That's incorrect. Nikola is the name of a female English person. It's Nicola.
Yeah. Well, that's my American accent says Nicola.
No, it's your fault. It's not your fault. But I know because one of my uncles, Mum's brothers, his name was Zio Nicola, Uncle Nicola.
Well, and I mentioned this on one of the podcasts I just did about names. When I was in Italy, I was so embarrassed by saying my last name, Sorrentino, because there it's Sorrentino.
Sorrentino.
Yeah, we don't roll the R's here in America.
You have to. You got to be Scottish. The Scottish do. Ireland. It's the car.
That's funny. Yeah. Well, what's funny about the Scots is even the English don't understand the Scottish, right? So.
Well, they consider themselves to be a totally different breed anyway, which is great.
Yeah, exactly. So now you I'm assuming that your parents they both spoke their dialect back then. So were they able to communicate in Calabrese and Sicilian? Okay.
We'll be right back.
Experience Italy like never before, traveling with a scheduled group or create your own bespoke tour with friends with philitaly.co. Pack your bags and follow Phil. That's www.philitaly.co.
So Siciliano and Calabrese, the two dialects, are extremely similar because the Kingdom of Sicily, back in the old days, going back 1,000 years, were all taught the same language. The variations came out later. But Sicilian and Calabrese is pretty similar. They're about 90% compatible.
Oh, so that's closer than I thought. Because my parents were from Naples and Bari, and they used to, there was a big difference there from what they told me anyway. They used to argue all the time over who was speaking proper Italian.
Yeah. Well, they used to argue about anything, really.
Well, yeah, that's true. So now you've done a lot of research. How far back have you been able to go?
So I've been able to go back to the 1700s, but back in Italy, when I talked to my nonna as a little boy, and then my auntie, who's the only sibling of my father, Provino is my surname, and it only became Provino in the 1800s. Before that, it was Provinus. And I'll tell you the story that my auntie told me, and I put things together. And the Provino clan went to Sicily in about 1180. They were knights from Normandy who fought in the Third Crusade and then were given lands in a place called Bagheria, Provincia Palermo. And so the Provino, as my aunt told me, are a semi-aristocratic. They've lost any titles now, but they were Normans, Norman lords given lands. And that's how they became Sicilian, and that's how my dad came to be there. And so Provinus became Provino.
Ah, that's an interesting story. That's an interesting story. Now, have you done DNA?
Have done DNA, and I have some also a minor. For example, I have I'm the eldest of four boys. Mum's from Calabria, dad's from Sicily, and I have more to do with France, which is the Norman part, and more to do with also Greek. So because the Greeks at one stage held that part, the Calabria and Sicily were called Magna Grecia, the Great Greece. I had just a tiny bit fraction from the Middle East, whereas my brother, who's darker skinned than me, and when I go to the beach and lie in the sun, I become red like a boiled lobster, whereas he becomes brown like a Lebanese boy. And so that's the difference in our DNA. And he's come up with a lot, about 75%, I think, just over 70, like nearly 80% from the Middle East. And that's why he's got that lovely complexion.
Yeah, isn't that amazing? Like, my dad was, he had a very dark complexion. He was the same way. And when he was out in the sun within, the summertime, within 2 weeks, he was really, really dark. And I guess my sister probably has more of that complexion than my brother and I, because I was the same way. I would eventually get tan, but first I would burn, and then it would get tan. And my mother was more fair skin, which is interesting because, well, I'll tell you, my mother, I did living DNA, and to get the mother and father lines, and my mother's line is like 95% from the Caucasus. There's no
Mm.
Greek, no Greek, going back 10,000 years.
Wow.
So it's really,
Yeah.
really something, and I can't figure it out. My father kind of has some of that Levant, and then up through mountainous areas, through Switzerland, and then into Spain, and then eventually into Italy. So they were herders and stuff like that. But yeah, I try to explain that DNA because some people get very violent when they say my DNA shows that I'm Greek and Middle Eastern, and I'm 100% Italian. I don't believe it.
Well, yes, I know. I know. I mean, at the end of the day, even in modern days, you have people here who say to me, they say, which part of Italy were you born? I said, I was born in Sydney. Oh, yeah, but you're still a foreigner, aren't you? Why is that? Because you speak two languages. I said, where are you from? Oh, I'm Australian. Hang on a second. You were born here like me, but did you come out of the ground in Australia? No. Well, where are your folks from? Oh, that was 5 generations ago. Yeah, but we're from England. Well, then you're Anglo-Australian. I'm Italo-Australian, but we're all Australian, you see. So, but back in those days when there was a lot of intermingling, you had slaves that were caught in Africa, for example, and brought back to Italy or to France or to Spain, and they were slaves in the palace or serving some lord or something. And if they had children and they married someone and they were half-breed children, they can be throwbacks later on. And there's a lot of stories where, people look more Greek. Or my brother's married to a lovely girl whose family is from Sicily, but she looks more like a Greek girl because that's when the Greeks inhabited and colonized Sicily 5,000 years ago. And she's the throwback, and she looks very Hellenic.
Well, yeah, and you know, my wife is she's half Sicilian and half Puerto Rican, and she's as fair-skinned as you can be with very, very light blue eyes, you know, and it's
Beautiful.
been and she's got some, you know, in her DNA, there's, you know, some Norwegian, like 10% Norwegian, you know, so uh,
Yes.
the combinations, especially in Sicily, I mean, everybody was there, so you could be almost
Yeah.
anything if you were born in.
We're one big family, Bob. One big family.
Yeah,
The human race is not a race, it's a family.
yeah, and you know, back then there was the intermingling. Now it's you know, everybody's marrying everybody.
Absolutely.
Back then it wasn't so
Absolutely.
much marrying as it was other stuff going on, but uh, that's what happened. Um, so now how about that? That was your dad's family, right? Well, how about your mom's
Yes.
family? Have they been in Calabria for
So
many years?
on, on my mum's side, for example, the genetic influence is a lot of the the Byzantine, the Ottoman Empire that held Calabria for such a long time. In fact, where my mother comes from, near Catanzaro, which is one of the capital cities there, and Catanzaro is the capital of Calabria. Up in the mountains, there's a place called Santa Caterina dello Ionio. So Santa Caterina is a saint, we would say Saint Catherine, of the Ionic side of things, that side of the peninsula, the right side of the peninsula, next to the Ionic Sea. Now, the saint is depicted a beautiful woman holding a sword, and at her feet is the head of a Turk. They call it Uturku, the Turk. But in fact, it's one of the Ottomans who he wanted to marry this beautiful woman in the village. You know that a lot of legends are created in folklore in these villages to preserve the history and the story, right? So Santa Caterina was a very forthright, like the Joan of Arc of this village. And she told this suitor to go and get lost. And he didn't like that. So a scuffle broke out and there was fights, swords came out, and she chopped the head off the Turku, the guy, the Ottoman leader. And that's what's at her feet. So when they bring out La Madonna and the men carry La Madonna during La Festa, whatever festa it might be, particularly the one of Santa Caterina, there she is in her full glory, holding a sword, and her foot is on a Turk's head. I had an uncle called Uncle Vincenzo, Uncle Vinny, and he had a little mustache, and I swear he looked like a Turkish man. And because the intermingling, he was a throwback from that. You see what I mean?
Well, yeah,
And so
yeah.
I keep exactly. So I'd tell him, I'd say to my brother with the dark skin, I said, yeah, but you're a Turk. And he gets upset about that. There's nothing wrong with Turks. Goodness me. They make good food.
Well, you know, my mom, she's from Torito, Bari, and
See,
her last name was Nicoletti, and the there's a story that goes back to the Saint Nicholas when the people from Bari went to uh, Turkey to get the
see.
relics of Saint Nicholas. And supposedly, there's one story that says that the men who went and got the relics, they were known as Nicoletti after that. So I don't know if there's a connection there or not. That's again, you don't
It's
know about some of these
interesting.
stories, you know, like how much is truth and
Yeah,
how much is
sure.
fiction, right?
But throughout history, Bob, I found out during my research, not everyone had a surname. If you were a servant born in the household of the landlord who was called Michele, Michael in Italian, Michele, and when you got registered for taxes, who are you? I'm Mario. Yeah, but who do you belong to? Michele. Oh, so you're Mario Di Michele. And that became his surname, Di Michele, Di Francesco, Di Mario, Di Maggio. We say in the States, you say Joe DiMaggio.
Hmm.
Joe DiMaggio. DiMaggio means he was born in May. You see what I'm saying? The family, the original. And so people got named after the month or they belonged to, or if he was Russo or Lo Russo, which is the Russian or Russian. We have a prime minister here who had an Italian father. His name is Anthony Albanese. They call him Albo for short, or Albanese. It's Albanese because there was a time back in the 15 and 1600s where there was a huge move of humanity migration from Albania to that part of Italy, from Bari right down to Calabria. A lot of Albanian people settled here in this area. And so they were called the surname Albanese. It was an adjective. He's Albanian.
Yeah, and
Make sense?
the interview I did that just previous to this was with Raffaele Fontanella, and he's been studying surnames for years and years and years, and he goes through the various ways of how people got their names going back to the Renaissance period, where there were too many Giovannis in the town, so they had to start distinguishing people by giving them some sort of name, like you said.
Correct. Yeah.
And
I've met people. Oh, sorry.
no, go ahead.
I met people with the surname of Ferrari. We say Ferrari, Ferrari. And they say, oh, I'm named after a car. I said, actually, Ferrari was the ancient name for a blacksmith because ferrum in Latin is iron, an iron worker, a blacksmith, Ferrari. So the surname Ferrari was like Smith in English, ironsmith, blacksmith, that sort of thing.
Right. And you don't have now, for example, Mario Televisione, that doesn't happen.
Not yet. In 200 years, we might, when there's no more television.
Maybe. Well, there's 300,000 distinct surnames in Italy. So
yes.
That's a very interesting thing. Now, I go back, well, my third great grandparents were the Count of Montebello, but I could trace back to the Ruffo family, direct to the Ruffos in Catanzaro and in different places, because of my grandmother. But Calabria was our favorite place in Calabria was Sheila. That was just so amazing.
Oh, Sheila's beautiful.
Yeah.
Gorgeous beach, Sheila. That's wonderful.
And it's nice little town. The steps are a little much coming up, but
yes, it's pretty high up. I want to tell you a little story that might put a smile on your audience, and that is that when I was a mid-teens, I used to take my mum to the doctor. You see, Italians get to an age where they got to go and see the doctor all the time because they're not feeling right, which is like everybody else. But we're sitting down in the waiting room. It's an Italian doctor. And so you can imagine the waiting room is full of Italian people. So Dr. Rumore was his name. Dr. Rumore would come out and say, Signora Pomodoro, which means tomato. And she would get up and go in. Then he'd come out and say, oh, Signora Lattuca. So one was tomato in Italian, pomodoro, and lattuca, which is lettuce. And one bloke says, what is this, a salad? Che è una insalata? Is there a salad here today, sort of thing? So going back to surnames, they can have all sorts of funny surnames. Even Coniglio, which means rabbit, which was another one. People were just laughing and making fun of it, but it was good fun.
Well, yeah, and that's what's so interesting about it is that, again, some people got names back then based on, they had a big nose, they had one eye, they had this, that, or the other thing. Like I said in the other podcast, one of my favorite ones is my friend Nick, Sette Ducato, right? So 7 Ducati. So, and we were kind of like talking about it, saying, well, he said it could have been somebody who charged 7 Ducati for something, or he may have had
Exactly.
7 Ducati, or he may have lost 7 Ducati.
Or it could have been the 7th Duke.
Yes, right. That too. We talked about that.
Yes, exactly. Right. Very interesting. I love that. I love that a lot.
Yeah, and and the names, yeah, like I said, the names are so very interesting. So now in this research, did you come across anybody like you you said, wow, because they had a certain occupation or they did something amazing or maybe not so amazing?
Yeah, I think that yeah, there's a bit of a story there with the Provino, my paternal side, dad's side. Uh, there was my great great grandfather. He had 9 children. He built he had a wonderful restaurant business in Palermo, which is 14 Ks. I think that's about 7 miles out of Bagheria. And he built a beautiful house as well, which is still stands and now belongs to my cousins over there because my auntie passed away. Dad passed away 2 years ago. My dad, he wasn't bad to live to be 92 and a half and was a man who smoked 60 cigarettes a day from the age of 9. And he quit probably 20 years before he died. But still, 92 and a half is pretty good innings, I reckon. And anyway, my great grandfather, he built this wonderful restaurant and place. It brought properties, and of course, there was all the hand me down from the time when they were Normans back then. They had lands everywhere. One of my great uncles, in a few game of cards, had lost all the properties of the Provinos and that was a big blow. There is one of my cousins who's Salvatore Provino, named like after the grandfather, and he lives in Rome and he's a painter, an artist, and his paintings go for $100,000 each a piece, and that sort of thing. But going back to the history that you're asking me about, I haven't been able to peg down anyone of great note, but I did find out that, for example, the time that the Provinos arrived in Bagheria, Sicily, the Normans, actually, that the kingdom of Sicily was very closely linked to the Plantagenet family, which was Richard the Lionheart, and he had lived in Palermo for quite a while before he went off on his crusade.
Oh, I didn't know that. I
And
didn't
so
realize
there were,
that.
yeah, yeah, exactly. I've got some notes here that I'm reading out to you. Richard the Lionheart, his father was Henry II, and he was the first Plantagenet, and they really held a hold on Sicily. Why did they go to Sicily? To get rid of the Arab overlords who were there for nearly 400 years. And so it took them 30 years, but eventually they kicked out all the Muslims. The other thing that people don't realize is that La Cattedrale di Palermo, which means the Palermo Cathedral, used to be a mosque. And when you look at it, it's got a huge dome on it. And when you go outside, do you remember watching Godfather 3?
Hmm. Yeah.
Have you
The
have you
the
seen
the bad
Godfather
one,
3?
yes, I remember watching the bad one.
Michael Corleone goes to Sicily and he meets the cardinal and he gets a absolution there. He confesses outside in the courtyard
Hmm.
of the church. In any case, I've been there, and people don't realize when you go through there, there are two different columns that hold up the arches. One was put there by the Arabs when they built the mosque. Another one next to it was installed all along the courtyard by the Normans to say that this is our church now, and they converted to a Catholic church. The two biggest cathedrals in Italy at the time were Palermo, which was one of the largest trading ports for Islam, and Napoli. Napoli has a lot of domed. They're all the old mosques that were converted to churches later. The So Napoli, the port of Napoli and the port of Palermo were the two largest trading ports for Islam in the Mediterranean at a certain time.
Oh, I didn't know that. And I actually trace my direct line back to Richard, um, through my paternal grandmother, because of her
And that's the one
connections.
from Sicily.
Uh,
Yes.
uh, she she's half Caracciolo. Her mother was Caracciolo, and that family dates back to 950 in Naples. And I think originally they were
Ah,
uh, from the Byzantine Empire also. So
yes.
because of the name, and it's Caracciolo in Italian, but in I've seen it spelled with a K in there, which of course we don't have. Going
That
back
I don't
to
have,
the
there's no
places,
K.
there's no K. Um,
Exactly.
but yeah, I had no idea that I mean, of course, I knew he was in the Crusades, but I had no idea
Yeah.
that he spent time in Palermo.
Yeah. I, I think that, and also the wife of King Roger, might have been Roger the second or the third, who was king of Sicily at the time. His wife was somehow hooked up with Richard the Lionheart's family. He was related to her. That's why he went to visit her there, and he stayed there for quite a. He loved Palermo. It wasn't the first time that he's been to Palermo, because Palermo was becoming very much one of those Norman strongholds and a getaway for a lot of the Norman noblemen that were throughout the Mediterranean. It was
Yeah,
like
it's a great
the
city.
the
We
jewel of
liked
the
it there.
Mediterranean. Yeah, exactly.
Yeah, we
Well,
we
now
loved it there.
it's a little bit, yeah, it got bombed a lot. I mean, there were about 3.5 years where it got bombed nearly every night when the Allies were trying to get rid of the Nazis out of there. There's not much left in Palermo. That's why Milano too was the most bombed city. And when you go to Milano now, it's all new. It doesn't have a spirit or a soul. And my wife and I lived in Lago di Como, Lake Como for 3.5 years. And so Milano was only a 35, 40-minute drive for us. And we'd take the train or drive the car, it didn't matter. But when you drive there and you think it doesn't feel the same, whereas Como was preserved, Como never got bombed. It had the Nazis there, but it never got bombed. In fact, Mussolini got shot just above the hills there, above Lake Como, just before the Swiss border. He was about to cross the Swiss border.
Well, yeah, and that's where my mom's family was from in Torito. They're about 30 minutes from Bari. They never got bombed. They could see it because my uncle was still living there until the 50s. So they would see the planes coming over and bombing the port and everything like that, and they would run into the fields. But they never got
Yeah.
bombed because it was a small little, farming village. There was nothing really there, you know. But my cousin told me she's like 90 something now, 92, 93. She was about 12 or 13 at the end of the war. And she used to go into Bari and sell things on the black market to the
Yes.
Americans and the English. Um, and I said, what did you live on? She said beans, mostly beans.
Yeah.
Um,
Yeah.
and then they would barter with, I guess, the English and the American troops when they came in. But I said, did you see any German troops? And she said, not in her town, really. They were all in the
Right.
city.
Right.
But Bari's the same
It
way. You
wasn't
still have the old,
strategic enough. Yeah.
yeah, you still have the old city, uh, pretty much, but to well, I guess it would be the west of the old city, everything is like brand new, you know.
Bomb. Yeah.
Yeah, yeah.
For that reason. Do you know, my dad, when the war finished, my dad was nearly 18 years of age, and he told me that at night during the war, he would have to sneak out with a lot of the other young blokes, the young men, that's what we call blokes here in Australia, young men, and they would go up on the hills and look for a particular weed we call it burridge in English, but they call it a burrania. And it looked a little bit like a cabbage, but a long leaf with some prickles on it. And he would bring some home, and his mum would boil it and take the prickles out. and make a soup, and they would eat that grain. That's all they had to eat for a long, long time. And the flour was very scarce. They didn't have things like even olive oil at one stage. And so Dad had to scrounge the hillsides for food, basically, whatever they could find, mushrooms, that sort of thing. Mm.
Wow, that's rough. That's really rough. Uh, I think you mentioned it, but I don't know. How old was he when he got to Australia?
So Dad, when he got to Australia, was 24 in 1952. And it was interesting because as soon as he arrived here, he got a job and he started working. And he told me a funny story. Australians have a habit of saying, "No worries, mate." That means, okay, don't, no problem. And someone said to him, "No worries, Sam." They called him Sam because they couldn't say Salvatore. "Hey, Sam, no worries." He goes, "Hey, what do you mean, no worry, eh?" He goes, "It's no worries. Listen, if a no worries are bad, then no worry to you and your whole bloody family. But if no worry is good, then it's okay." He didn't know what no worries meant.
That's funny. Well, when we were living in England, we used to we'd be watching a comedian. Of course, we understood the language, right? But we watch stand-up comedians or something like that on the television. And then they would get to the punchline, and we had no idea everybody's hysterical laughing. We had no idea what
Exactly.
happened.
Lovely. That's the best way to be. I got to tell you a story about my auntie. Now, my auntie, who is my mother's sister, mum was 3 years old when her mother died in 1934. And she had older sisters who raised her like they became her mum and she became their child, even though they were siblings. And so my auntie, who God love her, died in 2006 at the age of 96. She was actually a few weeks, 6 weeks before her 96th birthday. She told me an interesting story that she was in the my nonno's orto, which is the vegetable garden up on the hills, and she was collecting figs from the fig tree. So she's on a big branch. This fig tree was 200 years old, so it was massive tree, thousands of figs everywhere. And she had an apron with pockets in it. And so she was reaching out and grabbing the fruit, putting it into the pockets. And all of a sudden, she hears an explosion and something whizzed by her and the leaves fell. And all of a sudden, all hell broke loose. And she said she could see men on either side shooting at each other. And later we realized that it was when the Allies had arrived in the village and were pushing back Nazis. They were actually having a combat in Nonno's orto. And she stayed up in the tree for hours and hours, and she was scared and crying. But then later, the soldiers helped her down. The Allies helped her down, and she said all the figs she had in the pockets were squashed, and because she was hanging on for her dear life. Now, they're things that you and I have never had to go through. But just imagine all those people that lived through those kind of traumas, really, aren't they? It's crazy, but they had to live and survive through all that. And she told me the story like it was nothing.
Oh, that's some story. I'm like lucky too. That's an amazing story.
Yeah,
Uh, yeah,
yeah,
I've interviewed a couple of people who, either, well, not them, but their parents, lived through some of the battles, and the towns were destroyed, and uh, one outside of Naples where the whole town evacuated into the caves, and were there for a very, very long time. Even after the war ended, until they actually they didn't even rebuild the city. They kind of moved the city and rebuilt it, a couple of miles away from the original city because it was just so bombed out.
yeah,
Uh, um, yeah,
yeah.
really, really scary. But what this crap still goes on today. It just, makes you
It'll never
crazy.
stop.
Yeah,
It'll never
no,
stop.
I
But
guess not.
when we lived in Como, I had the privilege of meeting a wonderful man. He was in his late 80s. And he told me that as a little boy, he helped his father move contraband across the border to Switzerland because the Swiss loved olive oil, they loved Italian wine, they loved the pasta. And then he would exchange that for other things he could bring back, whether it be medicines or whatever. And so they did this on a nightly basis, but they had to be careful. They had to be careful. They had to paint their faces black and wear hats and beanies so they could, because the Nazis were everywhere and they couldn't be caught because they'd be thrown in jail sort of thing. But that was their living. It was actually to go across to Switzerland, which was a neutral country, and they would gladly buy Italian things and also barter a lot by giving back things that they needed back in Italy.
Wow, that's
So
something.
they had special packs, he told me, like it was like a big box on his back, and as a little kid he had to carry it, and his father would then, put a lot of stuff in there. And so him, his father, his uncles, cousins, they carried a lot of stuff over the hills into Switzerland.
Wow, that's really risky. That's very risky.
Well, it was back then, yeah.
Yeah, and I never thought I have to ask my cousin one of these. I never thought to ask. I don't know if I mean I know my mom's parents were sending money back to Italy to actually bring people over into Canada and then eventually into America, because our borders closed in, I think it was 1923. Nobody from Southern Europe was basically allowed to come in. And then even when my uncle came in the 50s, he had to spend like 4 or 5 years in Canada waiting to be able to come into America. At the same time, Australia was open, right? And I said to somebody from Australia before,
Correct.
I think Australia is probably, as far as the immigration goes, probably like 30 or 40 years behind where we were. Well, we had that big influx between 1900 and 1920. You guys had it, I guess, after the war into the 60s. Yeah.
That's correct. Well, ours continued to the 70s, but it's interesting because when I went to my mother's village, there was an old lady there sitting down, and she goes, "Who are you?" I said, "My name is Salvino." "Who's your mother?" "Rosaria." "I don't know her." "Who was your grandfather?" And I said, "Giuseppe Leto." "Nah." "What's his nickname?" I said, "Pepe Ucerimido," which means Pepe, which is short for Giuseppe, Ucerimidotto, the man who makes roof tiles, because Nonno had clay and a kiln. And he and my uncles used to work making roof tiles to build the houses in the village. "Oh, now I know who you're talking about." Everyone had a nickname. There was Gambaruta, which means broken leg; Testa Pinnata, which means bald head; Mangiacapiri, which is a woman with lots of hair, frizzy, and she's a Mangiacapiri, which literally means she has hair. That's how much hair she has. And if she didn't say a nickname, they wouldn't know who you're talking about. She said to me, "Now where do you come from? L'America Piccola or l'America Grande?" I said, "What's l'America Piccola?" She goes, "L'America Piccola, the small America, is l'Australia. L'America Grande is the USA." So that's how they would distinguish between people who had gone to America and people who had gone to Australia, because Australia was l'America Piccola, little America. Isn't that interesting?
Yeah, that is so very interesting. Well, yeah, and like I said, until I started doing this, I never realized that so many Italians, migrated to Australia. I had no idea. Of course, I knew. Well, I even learned, even
There
in
are
America,
many.
even in America, you know, I knew about New York and San Francisco and Chicago, but throughout all of America, there's been so many people who didn't just necessarily, like move from New York to these places. They landed in New York and then they took a train to Ohio because they were building the railroad, or they needed miners, or they needed sculptors, or
That's
whatever
right.
they needed.
That's
And there's
right.
so many Italian enclaves in the United States. It probably too many to count.
A lot of them don't even know where they originate from. People didn't even know that Lady Gaga is of Italian descent. Her
That's
surname
right.
is Di Giovanotti,
That's right. Yeah.
you know.
Yeah.
Madonna. Madonna's name is Ciccone. I mean, and it goes on and on and on.
Well, we all knew, but Madonna because we knew that growing up, But it's funny, growing up, if somebody asked you, "What are you?" you would automatically say Italian. We didn't say Italian American. We would just say Italian. And now
Mm.
then went to Italian American, and then after, once you go to Italy, you come back and you realize you're just American at that point.
By the way, you know where Madonna is right now, don't you?
No, I don't know. I don't pay attention that much.
Portofino.
Oh, is that where she is? Yeah, well, she's got the money to live in
Por she,
Portofino.
yeah, she's in Portofino. Portofino is a beautiful place, and she's in Portofino, but she's doing a little bit of a tour of Italy. Well, while we were living there were rumors, because that doesn't become public, that she had bought a house on Lake Como as well. I mean, Sting has a house there. Murdoch has a house there. Also, Nicole Kidman, when she was married to Tom Cruise, they had a house there, but I think they've since sold it. And George Clooney
Yeah,
has a
George
house
Clooney.
there.
Yeah, yeah. I think he has a
Yeah.
little. I think he has a little bit more
Um,
than a house, but
oh, it's a Villa Oleandra. Now, listen, I just want to tell you too that when we first moved into Lake Como, my wife and I, she got one of those maps about Lake Como and what to see, what's good to see. One afternoon, we're sitting down there having a coffee in our kitchen, and she goes, "Oh my God, look at this." I said, "What?" "Look at this church here in Como. It's like 400 meters away. La Chiesa di San Provino." San Provino, get out of town. So we went there and had a look, and lo and behold, in 834, this monk from Normandy walked for months and arrived in Como and built an orphanage, and he became bishop, the second bishop of Como, and they built a church called La Chiesa, the church of San Provino. And on the 8th of March every year, they open it because it's so old, you can't go, they're afraid it might break down. But they have a very short mass on the 8th of March to commemorate the La Chiesa di San Provino.
oh
I never
wow,
knew that before.
yeah, yeah, and I guess Provino. Does that mean they came from? Well, I guess was it? What's the uh, what's the place in France that's got a similar name? I
Or in
can't think of.
Normandy.
In
Oh
Normandy.
no, you might be thinking of the region Le Provence.
Yeah, Provence. So they didn't come from there.
That
They came from Normandy.
No, that's down the south. They come
Yeah.
from the north.
So
In other words, I've got some.
they were probably originally Vikings.
Yeah,
Yeah.
I was going to say I've got some Viking in me, not that much, but some.
Yeah. Yeah. Because that's the
Yeah, definitely.
Normans were well,
Yeah,
at least they
absolutely,
conquered there. You
absolutely.
know.
But it was at a time he went over when the Catholic Church was growing and, of course, was becoming the only sort of religion in the known world around the Mediterranean. So it was a very strong order to be part of that. Mm.
Yeah, yeah. Well, listen, Sal, this has been great fun, interesting stories for sure. Like I said,
My pleasure.
I love getting the perspective from, other countries. It's nice to meet Italians from around the world.
Fantastic. Thank you for having me on here. And, you're doing a great job. Keep up the good work, Bob. That's all I can say because, we're trying to preserve also our heritage. That's what we're really doing. And it's not just the language or the history, but it's like you said, our DNA. Whenever I go to Italy, my DNA sings. It just vibrates a certain frequency that makes me feel like this is where I belong, but I live in Australia, but my DNA was created in Italy, if that makes sense.
I know exactly how you feel. And I, there's tens or hundreds of thousands out there that feel the same way.